Protests in Iran have reached a whole new level today. Protesters have taken full control of 2 cities, and the local police and Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps militants have laid down their arms and joined the people. Experts say that if the protest continues at the same pace, a civil war could break out in Iran with the risk of overthrowing the regime of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. But another important point comes up here. The fact is that protesters in Iran against the Ayatollahs regime have taken control of 2 cities in Ilam province, which importantly border Iraq. That is, we're talking about the cities of Abdanan and Maliksha, and all this suggests that the protest could become cross-border. And in this regard, experts recall that just a couple of days ago, Western intelligence agencies warned that Ayatollah Khamenei had already developed an escape plan from Iran to Moscow if the military began to side with the people. And this is supposedly what happened in the city of Abdanan. But there is another telling marker. The Russian army is urgently evacuating the staff of the Russian embassy along with their families in Israel and bringing them back to Russia, which, according to experts, may indicate that Iran is ready to try to start a new wave of conflict with Israel, to divert attention from the protests and to impose martial law to suppress them.
Baba Khamenei.
Victory.
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 Victory. So, in just one night, protesters in Iran against the Ayatollah regime took control of 2 cities in Ilam province, which borders Iraq. We're talking about Abdanan and Maliksha. In the videos from these cities, you can see that people are really marching down the streets in huge crowds, celebrating victory. In addition, there have been reports that in the city of Abdanan, local groups of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Basij, along with the police, laid down their arms and joined the people. Military units and checkpoints in the city are now controlled by the protesters. From infection.
Subtitles by Dima Torzak. Subtitles Dima Torzak. Subtitles by Dima Torzak.
The president of the National Council for Human Rights of Iran, Mariam Rajavi, also expressed her gratitude on social media to the protesters in Abdanan and Maliksha for, quote, forcing the regime's security forces to retreat. This is the second piece of evidence that the security forces did not actually achieve victory there. In turn, the Iranian Tasnim agency claims that the protest action allegedly ended quickly after the intervention of security forces who used tear gas. After that, the protesters allegedly scattered into the surrounding alleys and control over the central streets passed to the security forces. But after this report, Iranian media stopped talking about these 2 cities altogether, in general. The protests in Iran, triggered by 50% inflation and the devaluation of the rial amid sanctions and the consequences of the war with Israel, have already spread to 27 out of the country's 31 provinces. Official reports state that clashes with government forces have left at least 35 dead and over 1,200 detained. At the same time, the state agency FARS reported that about 250 police officers and 45 Basij militia fighters were injured. Against the backdrop of mass protests, the Iranian authorities are allegedly already making concessions and have announced a package of measures as concessions to the protesters. And among these concessions is a salary increase of 43 instead of the promised 20. With the official inflation rate in December at 52.6, even 43 doesn't even cover the inflation. In addition, the authorities promised to reduce value-added tax from 12 to 10. I'll just note that in Russia it's 22. Also, the authorities in Iran promised to allocate $9 billion to curb the rise in prices for essential goods. At the same time, according to Western intelligence, Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei has developed an evacuation plan from Tehran in case the authorities fail to suppress mass protests in the country. According to former Israeli intelligence officer Benny Sapti, 86-year-old Khamenei may go to Moscow since there is no other place for him. Meanwhile, United States President Donald Trump stated that he is ready to use military force in case of a violent crackdown on protests in Iran, while in Tehran this statement was called reckless. And now the Iranian authorities have already accused the West of trying to destabilize the country's economy and have threatened a tough response to any attempts to interfere in the internal situation. But here a very important point arises, an important question. What was the catalyst for the protests? The main role in the deterioration of the economy, the country's economic situation, was played, of course, by the sanctions imposed against Iran by Western countries led by the United States of America. But it's not just about the sanctions. High-profile corruption cases in Iranian courts involving high-ranking officials and their relatives have strengthened the belief of many ordinary Iranians that part of the ruling elite is simply profiting from these sanctions. That these people, having secured special privileges for themselves and controlling the country's imports and exports, are transferring oil sale revenues abroad and making money through money laundering. In other words, the sanctions actually benefit them. They've simply learned how to profit from the sanctions. They've come up with really clever schemes to bypass the sanctions and make money at the same time. Basically, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is funded by this cash. Even government officials say that the so-called sanction profiteers are more to blame for the current difficult situation in the country than the sanctions themselves. The problem isn't only the sanctions, people are also benefiting from them. One of the first to speak out openly were the merchants from the Tehran Grand Bazaar, protesting against the daily fluctuations of the rial exchange rate. On December 28, they closed their shops and protested, urging authorities to stabilize the markets. Soon, representatives of other segments of society joined the protest demonstrations, and economic slogans quickly turned into political ones, up to the demand to abolish the Islamic Republic. Students, small business owners, and people from nearly all segments of the population protested in cities across Iran. And very soon, slogans against Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, were once again heard at the demonstrations. Let me remind you that the press in Iran is strictly controlled by the authorities, and foreign journalists are either completely banned from working there or allowed to work, but with very strict restrictions on movement around the country. That's why most of the information about what's happening in Iran comes through social media and eyewitness accounts. As you can understand, this makes it very difficult to verify these reports. And taking all this into account, many analysts still believe that the current crisis, the current intensity of protests, could have more serious consequences than the unrest of 2022. Because the Iranian authorities are currently facing both domestic protests and a sharp change in the situation in the region as a whole, the Ayatollah regime is now seen as weaker than ever. And here the Russians are making an uncharacteristic move. It would seem that everything is happening in Iran, but over the past 24 hours, the Russian army has carried out 3 urgent evacuation flights for the staff of the Russian embassy. Along with their families in Israel, they are being urgently moved to Russia. However, there are concerns the Ayatollah regime may escalate the situation. A confrontation with Israel in order to declare martial law in Iran itself and suppress protests by military means. But for now, this is just a supposition, so I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.